have we're on. So thank you for joining the Revolution 250 podcast. I am Bob Allison, the chair of the Rev 250 advisory group, and Revolution 250 is a consortium of about 70 groups in and around New England looking at ways to commemorate the anniversaries of American independence. And we are delighted today to be venturing out of New England. We have as our guest Mike Bunn, who is the director of the Historic Blakeley State Park, which is in Spanish Fort, Alabama. And we're here to talk about his book, The 14th Colony, The Forgotten Story of the Gulf South during America's Revolutionary Era. Mike, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So you remind us there were not 13 colonies. There were more, and you write about one, West Florida, about which I think most of us know very little. So what can you tell us about West Florida?
Well, the first thing I can tell you is that, yes, there were more than 13 colonies, and two, most people know very little about it, about there being more than 13, me included when I started this. My interest in the colony of West Florida really started from me living down here on the Gulf Coast, having just enough knowledge of its colonial past to know that there was a British period and there had not been a lot written about it. And so once I started researching that to figure out more for myself, I realized there was a story there. And you've got the story of a colonial enterprise on the Gulf Coast that experienced immigration, political fighting, settlements being founded, and war. And it's just a really captivating story to me that I think would be new for most people.
It really is. And you tell it very well in this book. And it has an astonishing array of characters who come through this period, this era. You know, William Bartram, the great naturalist, and James McPherson, known to us who are specialized in the 18th century as the author of Ossian, the faux ancient poet, who's actually a Scotsman. And then, of course, the big fight, the Siege of Pensacola, the Battle of Mobile. I mean, these other really interesting episodes. And how does this all relate to what's happening in the other 13 colonies?
Well, it relates to them in sort of a tangential way, because everything that was happening in West Florida, for a very good reason, they viewed as almost happening within their bubble. They were very well aware of the fact that they were part of this larger international empire. But you've got to remember the situation that these folks are in. They perceive themselves to be, and quite literally in some measure were, on the far edges of civilization as they knew it. It was difficult to get word back to other colonies on the East Coast, and certainly back to Great Britain. News got to them very slowly, irregularly, and they perceived themselves to be separated from what was happening in a lot of the other North American colonies. And they really were isolated in some degree. And that's all made just compounded by the fact that the settlements that were in the colony were widely separated and were not very thoroughly integrated, and there were no newspapers being published. Mm-hmm. The colonial government was a representative government, but they did not meet regularly, you did not have that single forum for discussion of public issues. And for all these reasons, and its economy and more, the place was really in survival mode more than it was in participating in anything else mode. Right. And so it was experiencing some of the growing pains that any other colonial entity of the time might undergo, but it had a few additional hardships that were really front and center in its existence.
Right. Could you just tell us, Mike, A, where West Florida was, and then B, how this came to be a British colony?
Okay, West Florida, as originally conceived by the British, was bounded on the Mississippi River on the west, the Gulf of Mexico on the south, the Apalachicola on the river on the east, which was the border between West Florida and East Florida, the Florida Peninsula, and originally the 31st parallel, which is just north of Mobile. It's basically, if you look at your maps, it's that border between South Alabama and the Panhandle of Florida. That's the 31st parallel. And what the British did, though, is once they established the colony, they tried to move the border northward, and actually were successful in petitioning the home government to allow them to move it north to the 32nd parallel, 28 minutes. That is where the Yazoo River enters the Mississippi. So it's modern day Jackson, Mississippi, Montgomery, Alabama is where that northern border was. It became a British colony through the results of the 7 Years' War. Long story there, no fighting happening in the area, but as a consequence of that war, Great Britain defeats France. France is forced to cede all of its colonial holdings in North America, and its ally Spain lost some territory too, lost Florida. And so Great Britain, when it won that huge swath of territory, it did not open up new colonies in the entirety of it, but on its southern extreme, on the Gulf, it did create 2 new colonies, East and West Florida, created at the same time, 1763, with 2 different governments, one capital in established colonial city of St. Augustine, and one West Florida in Pensacola. And that's the colony that I tell the story of, West Florida.
Right. And one of the main economic enterprises here for the Spanish, for the French, for the Spanish, for the English, have been trade with the native people. And you make it clear, there are a lot more Creek and Choctaw than there are settlers along this strip of land along the coast. So how are the relations among the Creek and the Choctaw, between the Creek and the Choctaw, and the British and the Spanish? I know complicated stories. I wonder if you could sketch them out a bit.
Very, very complicated stories. And what I try to do in the book is to tell them in their generality so we can understand the functioning of the colony, because there's a whole lot more that could be said and has been said about the inter-tribal and international relations between the tribes and the Native and the Europeans. In general, here's the situation. You got a population in West Florida that never exceeded 5,000 or 6,000 non-native people. And you've got the Creeks and the Choctaws, who are immediately bordering this territory, and they at any given point number in excess of 25, 30,000 individuals. So I always make the point that should they have had a mind to stop that colonial enterprise, they certainly could have done so. The way that they kept the peace was through trade, and it's the type of trade that the British didn't invent. This was already going on prior to them arriving there, but they did have some new supplies, new access to materials that Native Americans very much wanted, such as pots and pans and weapons, rifles, muskets, things that the Native Americans could use to make their life better. They were in desire of having these things. And at the same time, and I'm not sure this dynamic would have worked out as well as it did before or after, but at the time, the very time that they're setting up this colony is when the things that Native Americans could bring as trade items were in most demand internationally. And first and foremost, that's deer skins. They were using those for one scholar's called them the blue jeans of the day. They were making leggings out of them. They're making hats, book bindings, gloves, a lot of things that were in high demand in Europe at the time. And so for these 20 years that this colony existed, it's sort of the height of that reciprocal trade, and that worked to mitigate any of the brewing tensions that may have otherwise flared. Now, certainly there were instances of some discontent on both parties, but nothing ever arose to any sort of regular armed conflict. There was always this competition for the trade, and the Creeks and the Choctaws were competing against each other for these same resources. So West Florida is founded right at a time in which all these circumstances are working together in a unique way that they work together better at that period than any time before or since.
Right. I just want to tell our listeners that Mike is also the co-author of The Battle for the Southern Frontier on the Creek War, which is kind of the big conflict that comes about 20 years after this period between the Creeks and the Americans, as well as the Choctaws and the Cherokee were also involved in that war. So complicated story, and it is trade. And Panton and Leslie is a big flourishing and trading enterprise in Pensacola, and there are others and again, a lot more in the book I would recommend that folks read, as well as the other scholars you've mentioned who have written about that particular trade. I'm wondering, how do then, you say the British set up a governing structure that doesn't really work effectively for a number of reasons. Can you tell us a little bit more about this? The other colonies, the British had been set up by English folks and others over the course of about 150 years. And here we have suddenly create a governing structure. So how does it work?
Well, it worked like this. There was an appointed governor and an appointed group of advisors. Those advisors were the council, and it formed the upper body when the governor chose to call the legislative assembly together. So there were actually elections for representatives from the various districts in a lower house. So that was a representative government. But the trick is that it only functions when the governor called it into being, called it into session. And the governors of West Florida throughout the 19 or 20 years it existed as a British colony only called it into session 7 times. So it was not meeting regularly, and people were not in communication about it regularly. So it never became the sort of forum that frankly, we look at West Florida in this compact time period. We talk about its differences from the other colonies, but like you just mentioned, they had a lot longer period to develop and to orient themselves to this mode of government. West Florida was basically being a colony that was basically being formed out of whole cloth, superimposed on a region that had not English but French and Spanish heritage. And so all these things that were being set up, they never worked as well as they might have. Given 100 years, they probably would have taken root just like they did everywhere else. But it was a sudden change. It was a small population, and there were really no mechanisms to get people together in the same way that they had been laid for over 100 years in other colonies. So yeah, West Florida went through some serious growing pains, and that government was not nearly the factor in day-to-day life that it would become in other colonies.
Right. Yeah, you make that point that people are busy surviving and going about their everyday business, not really worried about what's happening with the assembly, the council, the governor. And the governors did come and go. You have this real almost revolving door, whatever the 18th century equivalent of that would have been with the governors in the 1760s. Then let's just fast forward a bit to the period when things are getting unsettled along the other colonies in 1775 and 6. So is there an effort on the part of these other colonies to get West Florida or East Florida to join in this common cause?
Certainly is. They actually asked East and West Florida if they would like to participate, send representatives to the Continental Congress. And in that section of the book, that's where I make the case that that story illustrates the mindset of West Florida, and it's usually labeled in general histories of the American Revolution that even mention West Florida. They usually just mention it just stayed loyal. It was a loyal colony, and you get the impression, and I will tell you that impression has been perpetuated in certain areas that, we were loyal to the king, we're different than other colonies. In truth, these people that received this invitation to participate in whatever was going on in Boston and other places, that literally seemed a world away, and they could not conceive of how that had anything to do with their daily effort to make a living on this far-flung colony that they're setting up out of from scratch. And there were certainly discussions of what was going on, and there were certainly among some portions of the population some general awareness of what was going on, and the people elsewhere in North American colonies had some assumption that, well, you're a British colony too. Surely you're under the same yoke that we are, and we got a common cause. The people down here didn't necessarily see it that way, and it was not necessarily first and foremost an ideological concern as much as a purely economic. They're trying to earn their living and receiving bits and pieces of information that sound like some people are upset about some economic things that's somebody else's problem. Now, I'm oversimplifying it, of course. There were certainly some people that were very attuned to what was going on. There's certainly some people who were very much loyal, but the general population did not see this as part of their day-to-day life. And so those efforts those invitations to participate were rebuffed, but they were not rebuffed out of this waving the Union Jack sort of spirit of loyalty. They were rebuffed out of that's not our concern. We've got enough on our hands right now.
It was really striking to me how many of the folks in West Florida were actually Scots who have their own history with English rule. And it's a too complicated story to tell here. And then also you have their next neighbor, of course, is Spain, and New Orleans becomes an important point. I was really interested in Oliver Pollock, who's an Irish merchant in New Orleans, and he starts supplying, and New Orleans becomes a supply depot for the American cause. Can you tell us a little bit more about New Orleans and what's happening there along the Mississippi?
Well, yeah, the Spanish, of course, controlled New Orleans after the 7 Years' War. That was a French colony, and they took over. And they're sort of trying to get their feet under them the same way the British did. But they had this enormous asset, the Mississippi River, that drained the continent and the city of New Orleans. And they sort of had a lot better head start, economically speaking. And the British at first looked at that situation and said, this is going to be our best trading partner if we can figure out a way to make it work. And there were a lot of clandestine operations that were going on because it was not officially legal to do that, to trade like that. But the Spanish actually allowed British traders to operate, to store merchandise, to actually navigate on the Mississippi. There was this reciprocal relationship that Britain was bringing in trade, and Britain was benefiting from the trade, but the Spanish were too. And that rocked on for a little while. Once the American Revolution starts up and it becomes very obvious that Spain and the people in New Orleans, certain individuals in New Orleans, are very much willing to extend effort to aid the American cause at the expense of the British. And the British realized that the Spanish are not only willing to do that, but they're willing to actively work to take back territory they lost during the 7 Years' War. That changes everything about that relationship, which had been sort of peaceful and amicable, suddenly turns into a serious threat. That now this colony is not here just waiting out this fight between northern forces, which may or may not open up a front on the Gulf. Now they've got a serious threat to their west that over time demonstrates they're willing to actively become involved in this. People like Oliver Pollock, great concern for the people in West Florida. And eventually, of course, it spills over into open warfare between those two colonial entities.
Yeah. Also tell the story of James Willing, who comes down the river and raids. Thinking about it, as you're saying in the book, the real focus, the real economic strength of the colony becomes the Mississippi River, the area along Natchez, and what becomes Vicksburg. And so can you tell us a bit about Willing and his raid in 1778?
A colorful guy, to say the least.
Yeah.
He convinced some people that because he had lived in Natchez before, he had some connections in the Continental Congress. And long story short, there was some discussion, but no willingness and no resources to open up a Gulf front in the American Revolution at that time. They wanted those harbors and those ports down here, but there was no pressing ability or need. So fast forward, that discussion had gone on. Well, Willing hears about some of this and said, if you just equip me with 50 guys and a commission, give me a boat, I'll go down there and I'll secure the neutrality of this colony, which I would argue is already about as neutral as you could get in North America. But he said, I'll secure that neutrality and I'll open up this communication on the Mississippi and Ohio rivers between New Orleans, which is already visibly demonstrating they want to support the American war effort, and I'll ensure the safe passage of those goods and supplies. So he comes down to the western boundary of West Florida, which is the heart of the growing settlements by this time. It's really the destination for immigration in the early 1700s or 1770s in the colony. So he comes down there, and basically out of nowhere, they had no idea something like this was happening. He just plants the American flag and says, if you will agree to stay out of this conflict, which they had no inclination to get in, he said, if you'll stay out of this, I'll protect your property. And then proceeds to go on and do anything but protect anybody's property. He basically, in a nutshell, conducts a campaign of plunder and destruction because he knows he can get away with it. He has the goal of recruiting people along the route, and it's almost piracy. And they're going to go down to New Orleans, and they can sell their goods, whatever they plundered, with the Spanish, because they know the Spanish are going to do whatever they can to harm Great Britain. And that, in essence, is what happened. There's a lot more details to the story, but the upshot of all of it was that it revealed to Great Britain and the officials in the colony just how dedicated Spain might be to harming their interest. And it also demonstrated how poorly protected their western border was. You've got a ragtag group of 50 to 75 just guys parading down the river, and they just wreak havoc. And at first there's this concern that there must be an American army of 2,000 guys over here to cause this much destruction. It's really just a few dozen guys, and it revealed some things to the authorities in West Florida that put them on edge.
Right. And they say Willing, he comes to New Orleans with about $70,000 worth of property that he's grabbed from these various plantations along the river and settlements along the river. It's an astonishing story. And, he's a Philadelphian, though. He's connected to the Willings of Philadelphia, and it just shows us a lot of things about the interconnectedness and the fact that people are traveling around throughout this whole area and looking for opportunities. Then, of course, this happens before Spain enters the war, and Spain doesn't enter the war because they support independence for America, but because Spain sees an opportunity, A, to help France, and B, to get Gibraltar back. But then I think the story of what happens when Spain enters the war and what Bernardo de Galvez really is doing is really extraordinary. The biggest battle in Florida happens in one of the longest sieges of the Revolution, is the Siege of Pensacola. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about that story.
Yeah. And I'm glad that you prefaced that by mentioning Spain's aims in the war. We sometimes, most people are not very well aware of Spain's role in the American Revolution, but to the degree that it is mentioned and general knowledge, there's this general assumption that they supported the cause of American independence because they were fighting against the British. But their efforts were entirely in self-interest, because you've got to realize Spain is a world power, just like Great Britain, but they're on the decline and they're having a hard time holding their colonial empire together. And the thought of this internal revolt that was yielding the results that it was in North America against the British, which was a much more powerful entity at the time, weren't exactly the type of things that Spain really welcomed. But they recognized an opportunity to both aid a friend in France and to hurt a hated rival and regain some lost territory. Not only did they want Gibraltar, but they saw an opportunity to take back Florida, which they had lost from a distracted rival, because they knew Great Britain's primary focus was going to be on this larger rebellion that's taking place for the most part to the north and east of there. And so Galvez laid just a marvelous plan. And before Great Britain even realized that Spain had officially declared war, he had already pre-planned a sort of a blitzkrieg campaign. And as soon as war is declared, he's in motion. And before they even understand what's underway, Galvez, in his first campaign in the late summer of 1779, has captured the three largest fortifications the British had on the Mississippi on the western border. He's already laid plans for a second campaign, and Great Britain is on its heels trying to defend this colony. And as you mentioned, there's a campaign for Mobile and a battle fought on Mobile Bay on the eastern shore. And then, of course, they go right into the campaign for Pensacola, which was the capital and by far the best defended location anywhere in the colony. And it's one of the longest sieges of the American Revolution, March until May 1781, involving more troops, more men involved in that fight than any other battle in Florida history to this day. So it's not Gettysburg numbers, but it's substantial, and it's a major campaign between two warring colonial entities.
And Galvez is only about 30 years old at the time when he's pulling this off. And when he captures New Richmond, which today is Baton Rouge, he insists that the British include Vicksburg in their surrender. We'll take that too, and they do.
They do. And you can I always, when I talk about this with do presentations, I always mention the fact that you can imagine the surprise of the commander at Fort Panmure in Natchez to realize that his fort has just been surrendered, and there's no enemy within 150 miles. But this was a well thought out, well planned, quick campaign that just disabled Britain's defense of its western border before they even realized the full scale war was underway.
Yeah. And then you have the British counterattack in Mobile in January of 1781. One of the people fighting on the British side is Philip Barton Key, whose nephew will write the Star Spangled Banner 30 years later. It's one of the great things in this story is these interrelationships of people that we'll meet later on in the story of what happens. So can you tell us a little bit about the Siege of Pensacola, the longest siege of the war, one of the longest sieges of the war, and also biggest battle fought in Florida.
Well, it's a dynamic campaign, and sometimes, and certainly people who are listening to this are probably pretty well aware of what siege warfare really meant at the time. But for people new to it, when we talk about the fact that Pensacola was a siege and a long siege, you get the idea that it's this stalemate, that there's one army out there trying to shell one fortification and they're just a standoff. But in truth, this was a dynamic, constant firefight involving land and naval forces. You had Native Americans involved, you had French allies involved with the Spanish, you had boats and gunboats out in the harbor and on the points, and they're actively working to get their lines on the ground closer and closer to these multiple points of fortifications. It's not one fort. It's a series of fortifications. And so it's a dynamic, active campaign that involves small-scale sorties and small bits of open field fighting, then longer periods of bombardment of fortifications. It's a really complicated and interesting campaign that takes place over months. Galvez is even near the front lines at one point and sustains a major injury that shot off the tip of his thumb or forefinger, I think, and he got shot in the abdomen. Almost took him out, but he survived and recovered. So this is a constant danger to the participants, and it's not two entities in a set position staring at each other for 3 months. It's a really involved, complex process. And there was a French fleet that was on its way somewhere else that they convinced to participate for a certain length of time. And so by the end of this campaign, Galvez's forces number somewhere near 7,000 men, which, again, if you study Civil War history, that doesn't sound that much. But in Revolutionary era battles, that's a sizable force that's besieging a vital point of strategic interest to the British, and it culminates with this shot that makes a perfect arc towards an open door and a powder magazine, which ignites 2 walls of a fortification, just obliterates them in one fell swoop, kills 75 or 100 men. When the dust settles, the British realized that there wasn't all that much left to defend after all this, and arranged for a surrender the next day. So it's just an incredible story of months of campaigning that I try to summarize in a fashion that helps you follow it. But there's certainly there's a study of the battle and siege of Pensacola on its own, and it merits it because it's that detailed.
It is. So we're talking with Mike Bunn, the author of 14th Colony, Forgotten Story of the Gulf South During America's War for Independence. Now, later, of course, plantation system develops in this area. Can you talk a little bit about enslaved people, African Americans in this area at the time who would have been part of the economy of the area and the social life?
Oh, certainly. The British were importing slaves, bringing slaves in, and they had what we call plantations, but I always use that word with some qualification because we're so accustomed to the word plantation in the antebellum South, meaning the big house and dozens of slaves and thousands of acres of cotton, because that's not what was going on here. There were very few people who had, there was a plantation owner that had a dozen slaves and 200 acres cultivated, that qualified for about as big as you could have. They were enslaved and they were doing the type of things that the enslaved would do for a generation, for several generations in the antebellum South. But most of the slaves that were here were working on small family farms.
Mm-hmm.
It's a different scale. It's a different pace. It's different crops. Cotton was not a big crop at the time. They're growing things like indigo and of course, growing corn, chickpeas.
Also cutting down trees.
Timbering. That was probably the mainstay for a lot of people, more so than the agricultural crop. The food crops you would produce was just taking advantage of the enormous stands of longleaf pine. So it's still, what we think of slavery, forced labor, but it's a totally different era as far as the scale, the scope, and what they're actually producing. And we have even less information on the day-to-day life of the slaves. The best source of information that I have found on them is the laws that the colonial, the General Assembly actually created. And they devoted, when they did get together, not all that often, but when they did, they devoted a large portion of their time to detailing what the relationship between masters and slaves would be and how the slaves would be regulated. And through those laws, you can see things that were going on. They're issuing things about, slaves cannot gather after night downtown. They cannot carry arms. All the things that they are being forced to put into law makes you realize that clearly there were some things that were happening they weren't comfortable with. And so you can deduce what may have been happening. And it was a development and an evolution to refine what that institution would be like. So you're seeing it kind of develop and play out in the Gulf Coast for the first time in this area on a large scale. The French had slaves, but the slaves that we know of in the French period, that whole entity in the Black Code and all that, that's more of a Mississippi River story than a Pensacola and Mobile. So you're seeing it develop really and take shape in the way it would eventually become during that time period.
Interesting. Thank you. So, Mike, what happens at the end of the war to British West Florida?
It becomes Spanish West Florida. Galvez had captured it by military force. By 1781, the treaty ending the war, establishing American independence. In 1783, clearly recognized that Spain was now the owner of this colonial entity. There was a debate, little conflict about where that border would be. The Spanish wanted that border of West Florida, the colony just captured, to be up at the 32nd parallel, which the British had moved it to. United States looked at the original 7 Years' War Treaty where they established West Florida at first, the British did, and they had the border at the 31st parallel. As I always mention in presentations, that was a sticking point, but the young United States had a lot of bigger fish to fry at the time. And so when they eventually got around to negotiating that, Spanish were forced to cede that to the United States, move that northern boundary back to the 31st parallel, and that disputed strip of land between the Mississippi and the Chattahoochee that was under question, that was immediately annexed into the United States. And a new territory created called the Mississippi Territory. That sort of brings full circle to how Mississippi and Alabama began their start. So that's where I like to help people piece it all together to understand how it relates to the American period.
Great. Thank you. We've been talking with Mike Bunn, the author of 14th Colony, which tells the story about the Gulf Coast. So thanks for joining us, Mike, and thanks everyone for joining us for the Revolution 250 podcast.
Thank you.